Well, here we are the next day. The motor was taken out last night. All of the motor mounts also removed. It's looking pretty clean. Well, I should say clean in air quotes. It's pretty dirty in here, but it came out pretty easily. Once we got the lift onto the motor, just started jacking it up and removing the bolt as we went to get the tension off of these, and it slipped right out with no issues. I am glad I took my AC lines out and everything ahead of time, because it made it a lot easier and more room to work and everything. And here's the D series sitting pretty next to the B series. So the next step on this is going to be swapping over the wiring harness for the motor over to the B series, building a VTEC wiring harness, and I am going to attempt to swap my alternator pulley from the D series to the B series alternator. That way it's a smaller pulley, it's narrower, and I'll try to run a shorter alternator belt. That way I don't have to dent the frame, because what I've read on a lot of these, or doing this swap, you actually have to make an indentation in your frame here. So once the motor's in, the B series alternator pulley clears the frame, or else it'll hit. I don't really want to dent my chassis, so I did read about doing the alternator pulley swap. So I'm going to try that, but I'll make another video more specifically about that when I get to it. The second half of the video showing how to remove all this stuff to get ready for the swap went a little fast. It was really time consuming to set up the camera for every little step, and really hard to see in the engine bay when all there is just a bunch of hoses and wires flying around. So, you know, look online, read a guide on how to do this swap. I really just went around the motor and disconnected everything attached to it. That's basically it. This D series, D16A6 is in pretty good shape. It's a lot cleaner than I expected it to be. Now that both motors are out of the car and I have them side by side, I can kind of inspect both the wiring harnesses. I know that I'm going to take my D series wiring harness that fits my EF CRX chassis, and I'm going to swap this entire wiring harness, all the plugs, injector clips, everything, over to the B series. Now, all the research I've done online says that when I do that swap, I will have one plug on this wiring harness left over that goes to nowhere. I think it's for whatever this is on the back side of the D series motor. And then I will need to add plugs for the VTEC solenoid, the VTEC pressure switch, the second O2 sensor, and the knock sensor on the back of the motor. So I'm gonna take this harness off completely. I'm gonna lay it out, inspect it, clean it up a little bit, rewrap some of the tape that's coming off of these things. Then I'll take the wiring harness off of the B series, and then I'll install the D series harness onto the B series motor, and then I'll get ready to make my VTEC wiring harness, which is going to kind of run alongside everything else and go through the firewall and drop some pins into the ECU plugs, so we can have VTEC. So here is that D series wiring harness for the motor laid out so you can see it. Everything looks like it's in good shape. A couple of the plugs right here just covered in oil and dirt, so I'm going to clean those up. But I'm going to strip it back a little bit and rewrap it with some E-tape and get it installed on the B series. And I guess for those of you wondering why I wouldn't just use the wiring harness that came on the B series motor and just plug that into my CRX chassis, most of the plugs are compatible. I noticed I was trying to figure out why I would stick with my chassis wiring harness for the motor, just so they match. But I did notice, in fact, that this plugs into the main chassis harness, and this is the D series. Now, the D series, you see, has these one round, one smaller square plug, and then this big chunky plastic wrapped eight prong square plug. So this plugs in directly to the chassis harness here with the square plug. Now, if we go look at the B series harness, this is why I wouldn't use the B series harness, because whatever was up with the EF JDM chassis, they did not have that square harness. There's actually three round plugs. So I think this one would probably match up, but these other two don't actually match up to the chassis harness. So that's why we're swapping the D series engine harness over to this B series, so everything is plug and play with the rest of the car. Here's a quick look at the two harnesses side by side. The one on the bottom here, this is the B, top is the D. You can see where I have these labeled with blue tape. Those are the 4 connectors I'm going to have to snip off and kind of make my own wiring harness for. This is the VTEC stuff up here, and then this is the knock sensor for the rear. So it's really making those 4 transfer over to this wiring harness, and then we'll be good to go. All right, so it's time to build the VTEC wiring harness. I took the wiring harness that came out of the JDM B16 motor, which is essentially a copy of what was in the D16 with these 4 extra plugs. Now, everything else is pretty much the same, and I just clipped off the knock sensor, the second O2 sensor, the VTEC solenoid, and the VTEC pressure switch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a separate wiring harness where I run wires for all of these to feed through the firewall and into the ECU. And the VTEC pressure switch actually gets the only 2-wire cable. It gets a ground to the engine ground. So I'm getting ready to make my wiring harness now. And these 2 wires were indeed shielded when I cut them off of the factory harness. This is the knock sensor and the second O2 sensor that I need. There was a braided cable that went around the outside for the shielding, and a rubber sheath around the outside of that. Now, the other wires, the oil pressure sensor and the VTEC solenoid wire, those are not shielded. From what I've read online, the shielding is there to protect any sort of voltage spikes from happening on these sensors when they're running in a loomed harness like a factory wiring harness. So when these are bundled together with the 30 or so other wires for the car, you want to make sure there's no interference that's going to cause the voltage to read anything different, since these are voltage sensitive wires. So I'm not going to replace these with shielded wire because I don't have shielded wire. I did purchase just a 4-wire wire loom here. So I'm going to be running everything through this. I've read if these are not bundled and these are just going straight from the sensors to the ECU, essentially, it's not critical to have these be shielded wires. So I'm going to try that. I hope it doesn't come back to bite me in the ass. But we'll see. In the event, I should be building this harness separate from everything else, so it should be easy to disconnect, and then at that point I'll have to source some shielded wires if I'm getting any sort of interference. just going to take a little bit of tape and mark off how long I want this to be. So I made the entire length of this cable. So this is actually going to have a break in it. This cable is going to go just the length of where the engine harness plugs into the chassis harness, because I'm going to put some connectors in between here to run these wires through the firewall and into the pins for the ECU. That way, if I ever need to pull the motor out, I don't have to pull any wires back through the firewall. I can leave this in place. All the connectors will break here, and this will be the end with the sensors. So this length from here to here covers me for the distance from the end where the engine harness meets the chassis harness all the way to my longest or furthest away plug, I should say, which is the knock sensor. So I'll split off 3 wires out of here, one for the VTEC solenoid, one for the oil pressure sensor, and one for the knock sensor. And then I'll run a separate ground wire out of the oil pressure sensor and ground it on the motor somewhere. So it looks like I have a red wire, a blue wire, a greenish wire, and a black wire. So I think what I'm going to do is probably, let me get the other sensors back over here. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and start the VTEC plug as a green wire. So I'll pick the greenest wire I have and go with that. The oil pressure sensor has a blue wire, so I'll go ahead and use the blue wire for that as well. Don't forget to put on any heat shrink tubing before you solder wires. I've made that mistake many times, and you're bound to make the mistake as well. It's no big deal, just cut it and redo it. So I'm going to use this reddish color for the O2 sensor. And what I'll do is I'll take a picture of this before I put all the heat shrink on. And just so I can remember what wire is what before I button this all up. And then I'll save the black wire for the knock sensor, but what I'm going to do is further down here, I'm going to cut and separate this shielding, and I'm going to thread the black wire out the side so I can keep the shielding around the 3 other wires and split off a separate branch for the knock sensor, which needs to run around the back side of the motor. So I just did a quick little measurement, and I'm going to try to split this wiring loom right about here. Of course, I split it on the wrong side, so I can't find the black wire. And I'm just going to thread this black wire back out if possible. Keep this all the same. And so this is how I'm going to run my knock sensor off to the side, back behind everything else. And before I button this up, I'll put an extra layer of electrical tape around this. I even have some mini wire loom plastic shielding that I'll wrap around this as well. So the last thing to do is run a ground lead off of this, which I think I'll do once this is installed. I'm not quite sure where I'm going to put it, and I need to find something, a little loop that I can wire this to the motor with. Okay, well there's pretty much the start of the VTEC wiring harness. Like I said, ground needs to go to ground. Anywhere on the motor with a clean surface. This is where it splits off and goes to the knock sensor. I'm going to come back and I'm going to wrap each of these wires that are exposed with some electrical tape to protect them further. And then I'll split this cable, and I'll eventually route the rest of it through the firewall and put pins on either side and some connectors in between here. Alright, so I'm going to extend my ground wire slightly so it gives me a little more flexibility to where I want to mount it. And I found this oddly large hoop connector, so I can put this on pretty much any size bolt. So I'm thinking this will actually reach right to where the battery ground is on the transmission. So the negative terminal of the battery jumps directly to the transmission case. And I'll probably wire it in there, because what better ground than that? Forget the direct.
So the next thing I did was de-pin some of the pins from the chassis wiring harness. These are the pins that actually go into the connector that connect directly to the ECU. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be adding one of these pins for each one of the plugs that I just added on my engine side of the harness. So one of these is going to be for the VTEC solenoid, the oil pressure switch, the knock sensor, and the second O2 sensor. So I'm going to take another length of my 4-wire strand cable that I got, and this is the side that's going to be going through the firewall. One end is going to go into the ECU, and the other end is going to go and connect to the engine harness that I already built. So this is going to be into the ECU plug. I'm using checking the ECU. So if you plug in, I'm going to plug in and I'm going to start in some connectors so I can disconnect this from the harness. Okay, this side is done. And I just got to do the male ends on the other side. So this is the chassis side cable, ECU, engine harness. Okay, and that should do it for the engine harness side. So, motor, chassis. Okay, now that it's finished, I'll show off a little bit of a wider angle view. But here are all the sensor plugs for the VTEC and the ground wire running into their own harness, with butt connectors joining the engine harness to the chassis VTEC harness, and then the chassis VTEC harness goes into the ECU pins. So I can already go ahead and pin these into the ECU slots where they go, run this through the firewall, and then put this on the engine. And once the motor's installed, connect these at the same time that I connect the motor harness to the chassis harness.